And welcome back. Established in 1913 as a response to growing anti Semitism and prejudice, the Anti Defamation League's objective is to safeguard the Jewish community and promote fairness and justice for everyone. Presently, the ADL remains steadfast in its commitment to combating all manifestations of hate with unwavering dedication. Joining me now is the regional director of the ADL New York, New Jersey, Scott Richman, and we thank you, Scott, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
When we look at defamation and we look at anti Semitism, one can say things are on the rise, others can say things are getting better. I'll just ask you your perspective.
So, if we're talking about anti Semitism, actually, I would say all forms of hate. Unfortunately, by the benchmarks we use, they are getting worse. ADL is an organization that, among other things, responds to anti Semitic incidents. Literally every day of the week, my staff is responding to incidents in New York as well as in New Jersey. And those numbers have been steadily rising for the past few years. In fact, if we look at the numbers of what we've been responding to, it's something we call the annual audit of anti Semitic incidents. It has quintupled in the past decade. So it's a phenomenon that's gone up 500%, and there's sort of no denying that data.
Scott, would it be that people are making more calls, or are these incidents more on the rise? Because people will say, "Listen, you know what? Living in a society right now where people have no hesitation in calling, whereas before that might have been something that's silent." Are people making more calls, or is it like on the rise? Are we seeing a combination of both?
Certainly, people are reporting better than they did in the past. We've made a big push for people to report. Data drives policy, and we do push people to do that. But let me just give you an example. You could say that over a long period of time, but in the 2021 to 2022 time frame, we had 1,000 more anti-Semitic incidents across the nation from one year to the next. That's a huge jump, and it's not just because people are better at reporting from 2021 to 2022. It's sort of the reality of what we live with.
You talk about your office going out and doing investigation. Talk to me about your office and the fact of when they go out. Uh, what are they looking for? What are they looking to do?
So we're talking about incident response here.
Yes.
This is harassment, vandalism, and assault. And ADL's incident response work is something that all of our offices do. I'm the director of one office of ADL, but there are 25 of us, 25 offices. So in San Francisco, in Boston, in Chicago, in St. Louis, whatever, we have offices, and they're all doing incident response work. Many times it's because people have reported incidents to us, and we work with victims. We get their story. We reach out to law enforcement. We work with social media. We work with workplaces. We work with K to 12 schools, universities. Wherever that anti Semitism manifests itself, we are trying to respond. It's different depending on what the circumstances are. If it involves law enforcement because we're talking about a hate crime, and we respond to both hate incidents and hate crimes. A hate crime rises to the level of a crime, and you can involve law enforcement. If it rises to the level of a crime, we will work with people, encourage them to reach out to law enforcement, file a report. We work really closely, for example, here in New York City with the Hate Crimes Task Force of the NYPD, a really important part of the fight against hate here.
When we talk about hate, any with all the work that you do, I mean, I'm asking the question, and I think a lot of people say, okay, that's a dumb question, but it's really a real question. Have we gotten to what is at the root of a person's hate from what you're finding with boots on the ground? I'm very curious to know because so many times we hear, well, there's a multiplicity of excuses, but I'll just get to your perspective. What are you seeing as the backbone to this hate?
Yeah, and I should be clear here. We're talking a lot about anti-Semitism, but the reality is the Jewish community does not live in a vacuum. There's been a general rise in hate, and that sort of rise in hate over the past decade that I quoted in terms of anti-Semitism is not limited to the Jewish community. It's mirrored in terms of of attacks against the Black community, attacks against the Asian community, homophobia, Islamophobia, etc. So this is a much broader phenomenon, and I think that the reasons for it are equally broad. This is not just particular issues affecting the Jewish community. So, for example, social media. Social media is an enormous driver of hate. It's also something that's being used for good. It gives people a voice. It democratizes society, but it also gives haters a voice. It gives them a megaphone, the kind of megaphone that they never had. Traditionally, if you wanted to get your voice out there, you wanted to get your message out there, you would need to go to a newspaper, television, radio, and invariably those outlets would say, no, your message is hateful. It doesn't fit with the values of our television station, radio station, newspaper, and they would send you away. They would effectively do what has been done since time immemorial. They would push you to the margins of society. Social media doesn't have those same kinds of restrictions. Policies that they've put in place have only recently been put in place to curtail this hate. And more than that, they give people a way to find others who share their hateful views. That was also very hard in the past. People with hateful views would be in dark corners. You couldn't find others very easily who shared those views, and it gives them a way to radicalize others, those who do not necessarily share their views but are susceptible to it. I spent 3 days in Buffalo following the top supermarket shooting there. Really horrific. I was there by Saturday night, and I went there to show my solidarity with the Black community first and foremost. But I was there for other reasons, one of which was that the media wanted an expert to interview about different things, one of which was the so-called Great Replacement theory, this idea of Black and brown people being brought into this country to replace the white people, a horrific notion that had begun to move from the margins of society to more mainstream conversation. But it was also about how a young man who was not necessarily going down this path could become a killer like this. How does that happen? Well, it was social media. He was radicalized on social media. So this is a big cause. Obviously, it does good as well, but we need to find better ways to control this hate on social media. Second factor I would give is polarization. We live in an increasingly divided society, a society where people take sides, where people say what happens on my side is good and what happens on the other side is bad, no matter what. So maybe what's happening on your side isn't all good, and maybe what's happening on the other side isn't all bad. And when you don't have a strong center, it's very hard to control hate, because what happens is hate begins to move from the margins towards the center. Only those on the left can control hate on the left, and only those on the right can control hate on the right. And if you're not willing to do it because you're giving an advantage to the other side, then that hate begins to move towards the center. And the third thing I would say is we've seen a general emboldening of extremists and extremist points of view in the past few years. In recent years, there was much more social censure about things that people would say. People have become emboldened to do and say things in this particular environment that they simply would not have done in the past few years. For example, white supremacist propaganda, stickering and flyering and banner drops have become ubiquitous. We see it all the time across the nation. This was barely seen just 5-6 years ago, and now we counted something like 7,000 incidents last year across the nation. People being bold about their views. Usually, if it's white supremacist, you're talking about a message of white power, really terrorizing for many communities. And you're talking about some sort of way to recruit people, usually a URL on that banner or sticker or flyer.
You mentioned the Tops Massacre, of course. I was there at the funeral for Ruth Whitfield, known Ruth for years. And as I was there, I remember one of the things that was said by the vice president. She actually touted that the United States is not a place for hate. And I wanted to get a little bit of your perspective, because I know you got an initiative that is a No Place for Hate initiative. When we talk about No Place for Hate, sending that message, getting that message across, How effective have you been?
That no place for hate message is tied to our education programs. I think a lot of people associate ADL with fighting anti-Semitism, the kind of incident response work that I spoke about. But we are much broader than that. First of all, we're not just focused on hate against the Jewish people. We were founded as a Jewish organization fighting against anti-Semitism, persecution of Jews. But we were also founded with the mission of securing justice and fair treatment to all. We've always had a multi-part mission, and very important for us. We are very much allies when it comes to other forms of hate, which is part of the reason that I traveled to Buffalo. Very important for us. We take the lead when it comes to anti-Semitism, but we're allies in that space. And a part of our allyship role is our education programs, anti-bias, anti-bullying, anti-hate programs in the schools, which last year touched more than 4 million students across this nation. Big piece of our work that flies a little bit under the radar. And No Place for Hate is a designation that we give to schools that have gone through a year's worth of anti-hate programming. It's amazing. Last week at the Skirball Center at NYU, we gave out banners to the middle school and high schools that had gone through the program this year, so they can hang it in their school. This school is a No Place for Hate school. We had hundreds of students who came to be together and say, we are a No Place for Hate school. We're a No Place for Hate community. Very important for our work. And to us, that's the measure of success. We're trying to create young people who respect one another. That's the bottom line. That's the goal. Respect your own identity and respect the identity of the person sitting across from you, or identities. Many of us have multiple identities. That's the goal. Celebrate diversity, celebrate difference rather than looking down on it. And we're trying to create that future.
Yeah, I've had conversations with people. I've had conversations where people talk about the ADL, they talk about the NAACP, and sometimes the perspective is that you're viewed as a reactive after something happens. But the reality is that even in this, as you've shown in other ways, that you are very much a proactive organization.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, ADL, NAACP, we were all founded around the same time. Very important, in terms of this organization and its partnerships with other civil rights organizations. Yeah, I mean, we certainly are reactive, but we run the gamut. It's from reactive to proactive, and definitely the most proactive thing that we do are these education programs, trying to create a better future. But there's more that we do. We do advocacy at the local level, the state level, the federal level. That's certainly proactive in terms of putting forth legislation. ADL was at the forefront of hate crimes legislation back in the 90s. I think many of us take for granted that we have hate crimes laws in New York, in New Jersey, in 46 states. But that was not always the case. In the 1980s, ADL began pressing for hate crimes legislation in response to a series of hate crimes. And this idea that you would have some sort of penalty, stepped up penalty if the crime involved hate was a notion that had not been introduced until then. And now, based on that model, on ADL's model, we now have hate crimes legislation in 46 states and a particularly important set of hate crimes laws here in New York.
What should people know about being a partner and an ally? What can they do to be a partner and an ally for the work that you're doing?
So, there are many ways to counter hate. First, it's something that I spoke about before, and that's reporting it. Last year, ADL had over 12,000 reports of incidents to our office. Not all of them were anti-Semitism, many different forms of hate. And we respond, we reach out, and we offer the resources that ADL has developed over 110 years of operation. If it's anti-Semitism, again, we take the lead, but our allyship role is very strong, and we have a lot of resources to offer. Second thing I would say, and so reporting it is very simple. You just go to adl.org/report incident, and you will find a small form there. And the closest ADL office, whether you're here in New York or you're anywhere else in the country, closest ADL office will be in touch with you. Second thing I would say is we need our leaders to speak out. And when you see hate, you need to be relentless in pressing elected officials or university presidents or principals of schools or clergy or wherever it is to call it out and say this is not acceptable. That this is a message that needs to be out there and people respect our leaders. The third thing I would say is when it comes to these programs in the schools, for so many years, those programs had been about a reactive response. And you brought this up before about being reactive. What does that mean? It means there's a bias incident in the school, and the school comes along and says, ADL, please help us through this bias incident. And we do. And then they say, we want to use this as a teachable moment. We want to put in place some sort of program which will be broader and will offer some sort of constructive response to this hate. So they do the No Place for Hate program or a World of Difference program. We have different programs, which you can check out on our website. But that's not the way it should be. It should be that we are in the school before, that we have a relationship before with the school so that if there is, unfortunately, a bias incident, we have that relationship, we can come in instantly, we've already been working with the school. So if you know teachers, if you know administrators, let them know that math, reading, science are all important, but also creating communities of people who respect one another is a very important part of the role that schools can play. You can find a huge amount of information on our website at adl.org/education. Many of the resources we offer are free. That No Place for Hate program is completely free. Nothing's completely free, but it's paid for by our donors who believe in this, and the school pays nothing. To let them know that this exists and this is something that they can be a part of, be a part of a force that creates a better world. And the last thing I would say is social media. We need to do two things. We need to, first of all, continue to press social media to enforce their policies. Many of them have policies that are put in place, and everybody listening can play a role. If you see hate, if you see misinformation on social media, call it out, report it. Social media companies, it's very hard for them to ignore reports of violations of their policies. They have millions of posts a day. They don't find all of these, but if it's reported, then they pay attention, and nobody wants their account suspended. Nobody wants their account revoked. And if they know somebody's looking at what they like, comment, or share, they're going to think twice about it because they know somebody's watching. But on the other hand, social media is a great force for good. We live in a country of free speech. And, people don't always focus. We take it for granted in this country, but many other countries have many more restrictions on speech. The way we've dealt with hate speech all along is with good speech, with counter speech. And we need to continue to do that. On social media, it's hard. There's so much speech that's coming out, and so many of us choose to ignore social media and to say, well, maybe that's not for me.
Right.
But we all have a role to play on putting good speech on there, and we shouldn't cede that territory to people who put on hate speech.
Absolutely. Scott Rich, we got to leave it there. He is the regional director of the ADL for New York and New Jersey. Thank you so much for taking the time and being with us here on these social justice forums. Great information. And as I said, it's good to hear, and it's good for our people who are watching to know that we've got organizations that aren't, just as we said, reactive, but very much proactive. Thanks for taking the time and sharing with us. And hopefully the job gets a little bit lighter over the course of the next year. Thanks a lot, bro.
Thank you.
All righty. Scott Richman, our guest. All right, take a quick break. We'll be back with more right after this.